Alright, hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the isolated queen pawn structure. It's one of the most important pawn structures in chess. No matter which openings you play, chances are you're going to encounter this from time to time. And basically, what is the isolated queen's pawn structure? Well, an isolated pawn is a pawn that doesn't have any pawns adjacent to it on either file. In this case, we're talking about the queen's pawn. This is probably the most common form of the isolated pawn. There's no pawns on the C or E file, and we just have this lone pawn here. And typically this results in situations where white has a bit more central space, and because of that, they're the ones who have the more attacking chances in the position. But on the flip side, the isolated pawn can also be a potential target, which in the long term could be a weakness if we're not careful. So this typically means, so say white here, they're going to be the one who is more the attacking player, whereas black is going to be the more defending player. And in the games we covered today, we're going to see how both of these roles kind of contribute to both sides' plans in the position. So to begin with, we're going to be covering a game that I played against a player who was a bit younger than me, around 1500 rated at the time, and I was rated around 2000, and I did draw the game, which I wasn't happy with, but around the first half of the game, I played quite well. So begun with e4, c5, c3, and just want to note the Alpine Sicilian. If you want to get an isolated queen's pawn with white against this Sicilian, this is a decent way to play. And essentially you got this position, quite common, and I play this very in line with bishop f5, bishop e2, takes, and one of the key ideas of this whole bishop f5 line is that here I get to exchange on b1, and this kind of brings us to one of our main plans when we're playing against the isolated queen's pawn, which is that generally speaking it is easier to attack the d4 pawn, or any weak pawn for that matter, if we trade off as many mine pieces as possible. So that makes this kind of bishop takes b1 move fit in with our plans very nicely, kind of from a strategic point of view, even though it is kind of more concrete opening theory. And I should also note, because we trade this knight off on b1, there's no longer any kind of knight to3 ideas trying to attack the queen on d5, kicking away from the square where it is very nicely blockading the pawn on d4. And in general, this is a very important strategy when you're playing against the isolated pawn. It can be quite annoying if you allow it to come to like d5 and start pushing away like all of your pieces. For example, here in this position, if I did not take on b1, say I played some random move like a6, if knight c3 came and then queen d7, d5, and this really illustrates how important it is to contain the isolated pawn, because even though it might temporarily be a weakness on d4, or it might appear that way at least, if you're not careful, it could very quickly push to a square like d5 where it can become very active and pose lots of threats, and this is definitely not something that you want to allow. And so coming back to this position, once we kind of have this pawn blockaded, which is a very important part of playing against the isolated pawn, you won't always be able to do it, but in general it's definitely something you should try and achieve. You might not always have a queen on d5 though, this is a little bit rarer, but in many cases you will at least have, say, a knight on d5 square, or it might go from f6 to d5, very common way of playing. And here you saw I played this bishop b4 check move, and essentially here, once again, if you listen to what I said earlier, you would know that taking on d2 is a pretty decent move, simply trading minor piece. However, at the time I thought that was too good for my own advice, and I played bishop d6. This is kind of sometimes something that strong players will do, where they'll provoke the bishop to come to this d2 square, where they're arguing it's not so good, maybe you want to come to this b2 square, so we're kind of luring the bishop away from the square it really want to go to, and instead leaving it on this very undesirable d2 square, where I'm also threatening to take on d4 at the moment. However, it probably would have just been simpler to just trade the pair of mine pieces here. The game goes on though, I'm still doing fine, I play knight f6, do all this, he threatens my queen, bring my queen away, and here my opponent initiates a trade of queens with knight e5, which I didn't think was so good, because typically, as I mentioned earlier, the side with the isolated pawn, which is white here, they're going to be the one who wants to attack, and trading off queens pretty much implies that white is going to have zero attacking chances against our king in this position. However, it is worth noting though that even if they don't trade off queens here, it's very difficult to imagine a scenario in which their queen actually will be helping out with an attack on the king side, because of the fact that kind of their minor pieces aren't doing a very good role of really contributing to attack. In particular, this dark squared bishop on the c3 square, it's basically doing nothing here, just kind of, it's a tall pawn in a sense, tall pawn, because like it's basically just acting like a pawn. It's not actually doing anything special. It may as well just be a pawn in this position, right? It's just kind of seen there, it's kind of blocked off in this diagonal. Anyway, so Knight e5 was played, and basically this allowed me to exchange queens. And here I play a move that's very typical, knight b4. I attack this pawn here, and basically if he tries to defend it by just moving it, now I can just bring a knight here, and notice how these knights work very well in harmony together, both kind of working over controlling the d5 square. And if white simply takes one of the knights, we just replace it with the other knight, and we still retain our blockade over the d5 square. And notice how, once again, trade the pair of minor pieces is something that we want to do. And now we can think about bringing our rook to the c file. Black is doing very well here. Instead, though, my opponent, he took on b4, and he couldn't really avoid making this trade at this point. I think this is more or less what he had to do. And after takes, rook e3, knight d5, once again, I bring the knight to the d5 square, blockading the isolated pawn. In this stage, he just decides to take it. He can't handle it anymore. If he played something like this, he might have been afraid of knight c3, kind of forking the rook here and the pawn. Understandable, so he avoids that. He takes, but now I'm still blockading the d5 pawn, this time with my rook though. And the rook is also a very nice blockader of the pawn, but you have to be a little bit careful that the knight can't easily kick it away, which is not the case in this position. He just played rook ed3, rook c8. And at this point, this is kind of the ideal position that you should be aiming for when you play against isolated pawns. Queens are being traded off. It's an endgame. Most of the pieces we have on are heavies right now. There's only one pair of minor pieces, bishop and knight. But I would say this bishop is a bit better than the knight. And as we're going to see, it does play an important role against targeting this d4 pawn here and a couple moves. So my opponent plays knight c4 to stop my rook from invading on the c file. So I decided to change plans a little bit, bring my rook to d8, just targeting the d4 pawn. And after rook d7 here, we're going to notice how all the pieces are kind of stacked up on the d file. And everything pretty much revolves around this d4 pawn at the moment. My rooks are targeting this pawn, white's rooks are defending this pawn. And I just really want to instill this into your guys' brain, is that when you're playing with the isolated pawn, this is exactly what you want to avoid. This is not a very fun position to play. My opponent played knight c2, trying to kick the bishop away, but I could play this very nice bishop c5 move, simply targeting the d4 pawn here. And if takes happens, then of course just win in exchange, so doesn't want to do that of course. Tries playing b4, I just bring my bishop back very calmly, keep an eye on this d4 pawn, and notice how it's very difficult for white to actually move anything. You can't bring a rook away from the d file because then this pawn would hang. If he tries moving the knight, the d4 pawn would hang, so all he pretty much has to do is just play moves like a3, try bring the king somehow. And here I played a really nice move, kind of highlighting how kind of desperate white's position is. My opponent might have thought that he could just sit on this position and defend all day, but that's rarely the case in these sort of situations. Here, a very natural move would have been to try and play something like e5, increasing the pressure on the d4 pawn, but you will notice that white can actually play d5 here, and all of a sudden the isolated pawn, which is seemingly quite weak on d4, is now very strong on d5, and maybe this knight can come in, so it's like c4 all of a sudden. This is definitely something that you want to try and avoid. However, I came up with this move rook d5, the idea being that my opponent moves his king, and now I can play e5, and I'm attacking the d4 pawn, but now there's no way for white to really deal with it, because he cannot push his pawn to d5, because my rook is of course occupying the square. That's one of the big powers of blockading the isolated pawn. And so at this point, my opponent played knight e3, pretty much gave up on the fact he's not going to be able to hold the pawn. I played rook takes d4, takes, and at this point I should have either played bishop takes d4 or rook takes d4. Instead though, I played e takes d4, and after knight c4, it was very difficult to win this position because I kind of screwed myself over, giving myself this passed pawn on the same card as my dark sword bishop here, when it becomes very difficult to really advance the pawn now, because this king can always come to e2, blockade this d3 square, and basically I end up drawing this game since there's no real way to make progress here. If I instead played something like rook takes d4, I wouldn't have had that kind of awkward situation here, and I think I would have won pretty easily. Yeah, just to recap, the main ideas from this game are one, to kind of make sure that you're able to blockade the pawn on d4 with a queen, knight, rook, whatever it may be. Exchange pieces when you can, particularly minor pieces. You want to try and keep the heavy pieces on, especially the rooks. The queens are a lot kind of more acceptable to trade off, since that diminishes white's attacking chances. Say in this position, for example, my opponent played knight e5. That was pretty much a strategic error, which was very much in my favor. And after this, I tried to blockade the d5 pawn once again. We exchanged a couple of minor pieces along the way, and eventually I was just able to have this position where basically my opponent had no sort of counterplay at all, and I was just able to very kind of calmly build up my pieces so they could be in a position to pile on this d4 pawn. And eventually I did win it, but unfortunately, because I was kind of an idiot, I recaptured the wrong way here and allowed my opponent to draw. Alright, so now we're going to be looking at a game from the white perspective, or the player playing with the isolated pawns perspective, on how to really get an attack going. This is a lot more difficult, at least in my opinion, than kind of the defensive role, which is kind of generally the idea is a lot more straightforward, where when you're attacking, it's like there are some kind of key ideas, which we'll see in this game, but in general, kind of putting it all together, there's a lot of times concrete moves, which are a lot more kind of difficult to generalize and come more to your own kind of creativity over the board, as we're going to see in this game. So basically, we have a Queen's Gambit accepted here, and this is a very common way you're going to see the isolated pawns appear. We get this position, and here black eventually took on d4, and we get the isolated queen's pawn structure. Now bishop e7, bishop g5, just putting the pieces on the axis squares. And compare this to the last game where we saw this bishop here on the c3 square. Obviously on g5 it's a lot more active, and hence it's going to make the attack a lot easier for white. So after castles, rook c1, natural move, bishop b1. This is a very kind of typical way of playing. We don't want to allow black to trade this knight for our bishop here. Our bishop is a very important piece in the attack here, so you want to make sure we keep this guy on. b5 here, a3, kicking the knight away. Notice how black has a blockade over the d5 square here, as we mentioned in the last game, very typical plan here. And here white allows an exchange of mind pieces with knight takes d5. This is for a very concrete purpose, because after knight takes d5, keeping the blockade here, we get queen d3 with tempo attacking the h7 pawn. And this is a key principle when you're playing with the isolated pawn. I also made another video on this called Typical Mistakes in Chess, playing slowly. And it kind of is this idea where when you have this sort of static disadvantage here, like an isolated pawn, you want to make sure that you're really playing quickly, not losing any time, and just going like straight for the attack, not losing any momentum. And that's exactly what we're doing with queen d3 here, not wasting any time, playing every move with tempo here. g6 was played, defended h7 pawn from mate, bishop h6, again another tempo move, attacking the rook here, rook e8, knight e5, bringing the knight into a very active square. And this is kind of very instructive. We're just seeing white's trying to play lightning fast, get an attack going, because if they're slow, then black is just going to consolidate and pile up on this d4 pawn eventually, kind of similarly to how we saw in the last game. And so black played bishop b7, queen f3, and once again we're just seeing white trying to play very quickly here, not wasting any time, just going straight after the f7 pawn, bishop f6. And here this is kind of a situation where it might not be that clear to kind of see what to do, because it looks like black is kind of consolidated. White has no obvious move here, like if you try playing something like knight c6, it doesn't really work because black can actually just take it, takes, and then play bishop takes d4. And white's actually just a pawn down here now. They gave up their very strong knight on e5, so that's something you don't want to do. Instead though, the player who was playing white here, Nishigiri actually, he played bishop e4, increasing the pressure on this diagonal actually. And after queen e7 here, his idea was actually to take on d5, removing this knight here. And it looks kind of counterintuitive because I discussed earlier, you really don't want to be trading off minor pieces when you're the side with the isolated pawn. That's what the side playing against the isolated pawn would want to do usually. But it has a very concrete purpose, and as I mentioned earlier, just at the beginning of this game, when you're playing with the isolated pawn, the plans are a lot less clear-cut, and generally you have to be kind of less dogmatic and kind of play things that might not look like they're right, but they serve a concrete purpose to the kind of greater plan, and that is the case here. After bishop takes d5, queen f4, if black kind of just does nothing, they dick around with rook a b8, white can actually play rook c7 here. And the whole idea is that if black takes this, then we just play queen takes f6, and here we have mate on g7 coming the next move, which is just unstoppable. So in the game, black responded to that and played bishop h8. So now if rook c7, queen takes c7, and there's no bishop on f6 to capture, white is down a rook. Anish was smart enough to realize that, and in this position he played knight g4, And this might look kind of a bit weird bringing knight away from a square, which looks really strong, but we have a different threat now, which is that now we want to play bishop g5. And this is just a very straightforward idea, kind of just trying to take over the f6 square, and if we can do this, like say black just played for c8, being very ignorant, and they try to do something like this, we just go knight f6 check, take, now bring the queen to h6, and basically there's nothing black can do to stop this, and we're just going to be mating them on the next move or so. So in the game, black played f6 here, but of course now trying to stop this whole bishop g5 idea, he allows rook c7, now the knight cleared the way for the queen to control the square. And now black did not want to play something passive like queen d8, we might have a clever move like bishop g5, the idea being we're just piling up pressure on this pawn once again, and if black takes it, we just have knight h6, and this is actually mate. And if black tries to defend that with something like rook f8, well, once again, knight h6, and that is actually mate. So he tried putting this clever in-between move with e5 here, and white just played queen c1, keeping an eye over the rook here, defending that. And after queen e6, Anish just plays this very nice move, a3, just keeping the knight on this very nice attacking post. And after e takes d4, this turns out to actually be a blunder, because after bishop f8 from white here, it turns out that black is really kind of just defenseless here. Basically, the idea is that queen h6 is coming, just simply trying to kind of attack this h7 pawn and mate black, and it's not very easy to really stop them from doing that. If rook takes f8, once again, this is knight h6 idea, very nice. If king takes f8, queen h6 comes, and pretty much we're mating them on the next move like this. So that led black in the game to avoid both of these moves and instead play what looked like a pretty reasonable move, rook ec8, but Anish managed to find this really clever move here, queen c5, defending the bishop here, and basically knight h6 is in threat. If rook takes c7, knight h6 is just mate remarkably because the king can't take here, because the queen is defending the bishop. Note that if we tried to kind of reverse things and play knight h6 first and then king takes queen c5, black would just safely play king e8, and despite the king kind of being in the middle of the board and having all these attacking pieces around black's king, it turns out here that white doesn't have any follow-up, and black's going to manage to exchange these rooks off and just be absolutely fine, and considering their piece up, it's just completely lost for white at this point. So after queen c5 was played, Anishi's opponent just resigned here. So to kind of recap this game, we saw that there were kind of some basic attacking ideas here, and just kind of basic ideas in general, like this bishop b1 thing, kicking the knight away like here, taking here and very quickly going queen d3, provoking g6 and then to play bishop h6, bringing knight to e5. This is all kind of very basic stuff that you should kind of drill into your head. These are kind of natural moves you want to play when you're playing with the isolated pawn. But less kind of simple is like when you get to this position, it's like it's not that easy to really find a move what to play here. And this is the kind of stuff that requires a lot more kind of creativity when you're playing with the isolated pawn, as opposed to when you're playing against the isolated pawn, where you kind of just kind of follow a lot of set moves which are very natural to play, just kind of pile up on the pawn here, defend, whereas white really has to prove that they have an attack which is a lot more difficult to do, at least in my opinion. For example, in this whole like position here, like conventionally you would not consider bishop takes d5 to be very natural, but in this position that is exactly the best move to play, and you found that all, and you found this whole like rook c7 idea. Like this is the kind of stuff which is going to concretely depend on the position you have on the board, but it's kind of very instructive to see how this can kind of play out in a game. Alright, so the final game I'm going to be covering is once again from the attacking perspective here. With the isolated pawn in this game, we had the English opening that very quickly transposed into what we'd call a Panov-Caro-Kann variation, which usually occurs via the Caro-Kann, of course. I'll just show it briefly. It usually arises after this position here, takes, c4 here, and we get some position like this, where something like this will happen, bishop c4, but in the game we had a bit of a different move order here. We had this position, rook e1, had some moves like this, b5, and this is a position that I really want to talk about, which is that sometimes, okay, we might go for moves like bishop g5, knight e5, and trying to attack on the king side, but sometimes what we can actually do is trade off our isolated pawn with a move like d5. In the situations in which you're most likely to want to play this d5 move is when your opponent has kind of been slacking on the development here, like we've seen what black has been doing here. They've been spending a lot of time playing moves like a6 and b5, which is a bit slow if we're being honest. So after e takes d5, knight takes d5 takes, what we can actually do is not play bishop takes d5, but rather queen takes d5. And the idea is not to really exchange queens. If black exchanges here, though, that's really not a queen exchange at all, because after bishop b7 takes, rook takes e7, why is just a piece up here? So what they must do is play bishop b7, and here, once again, I must reiterate, our idea was not to exchange queens, but rather it was that black couldn't take in the first place. Now they kind of can. So now that they can take, we're going to avoid that and play queen h5. And now we're really going to see how earlier black just exchanged their knight here on f6 for our one on d5. And now they really are lacking defensive pieces around their king here. And white is kind of going to quickly build up an attack here. And after queen c7 in the game, bishop g5. If black kind of just ignores this bishop here and plays something like rook a8, bringing the rook to a central file, now we're going to notice that this bishop here, after we eliminate it, now unlike in this position here, after knight g5, where black would just take it, in this position, after knight g5, no such thing can occur, and after more h6, trying to defend against mate, of course, well, we could take on f7 in multiple ways, probably simplest is just play knight takes f7. So, here in this position, black is best off trying to take on g5, and after takes h6, but after rook e3 here, which is a very nice move, from white here, simply just trying to bring the rook into the game and not really caring at all if black takes it, because if black does take, just rook h3, and it's very difficult to, probably impossible actually, to simply stop queen h8 mate coming. So in the game, what black tried to do was they tried to play knight a5 here, but it turns out that white has only one winning move in the position, but they managed to find it with queen g6. If we didn't play this move immediately, black would probably play knight c4 here, blocking this bishop off on this diagonal. But once again, we're making use of the fact that all our pieces are in the right position at the moment, so we have to use this moment right now to make something happen. And with queen g6, we're utilizing the fact that the bishop is doing a very nice job of pinning this pawn down on the king so they cannot take, befriending queen h7 mate, and after h6 g5, rook h3, rook fc8. Now if we can't really do something like this, maybe we're still winning here, because now the king runs away. But instead here, what white did in the game was they made sure the king is never going to get out of this kind of box here, and we're going to trap it in. Queen h7, queen h8, mate is coming next, and black just resigned here. Alright, so all in all, a very kind of flashy game here with lots of interesting tactics. The main takeaway I want you guys to learn from this game is that when your opponent plays slowly, like in this case with a6 and b5, leaving this bishop on c8 undeveloped, you can kind of consider d5 in some cases, just simply trying to blow up the position and kind of create kind of a situation in which your piece activity is just so overwhelming that the other side can't really handle it. And once again, if your opponent's kind of like equal in development, this might not work so well, but in some cases, like in this game, it might work really well and just kind of blow your opponent off the board. Alright, so thank you to those of you who stuck around till the end of the video. I hope you liked it and found it instructive. If you did, like the video and also subscribe to the channel for more content like this. And also leave a comment down below if there's any questions you have or any kind of other pawn structures you'd like me to cover or any other topics in general. But anyways, until next time, I will see you.